Welcome to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, hosted by Dr. Catherine B. Stevens. Early Matters features in-depth conversations with leading researchers, practitioners, and policy experts on what matters most for young children and their families to thrive.
Welcome back to Early Matters. I'm Catherine Stevens, your host and the founder and president of the Center on Child and Family Policy. I'm delighted to welcome Jenet Erickson to the podcast today. Jenet is an academic researcher specializing in maternal and child well-being in the context of work and family life. She's a fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, a fellow of the Wheatley Institution, and an associate professor at Brigham Young University. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, Slate Magazine, and the Today Show, among others. One major focus of her work has been on the effects of childcare on young children. She takes an exceptionally rigorous and nuanced approach to this topic, and I'm excited to talk with her about what she thinks is most important for us to understand about this issue. Jenet, welcome, and thank you for joining Early Matters.
So nice to be here, Catherine. Thank you.
So, as I described, your focus is on maternal and child well-being in the context of work and family life. And to start with, I'd love to hear about what led to your interest in this. As far as I understand, you got a bachelor's degree in nursing, followed by a master's degree in linguistics. And then it seems like you shifted gears somewhat and went on to get a PhD in family social science from the University of Minnesota. How did this path unfold for you?
Yeah, Catherine, thank you. Sometimes when you look back, you're like, I see that it makes sense. And at the time,
Right.
but what is interesting is that in both nursing and linguistics, I'll never forget in those studies, while a nursing student, I had to do a little bit of extra research on attachment, interestingly enough, because in studying human development, it was clear that there was this powerful bonding process that was essential that shaped physical well-being for sure. And also, of course, emotional well-being. And so I did a little research in that. And then when I got into linguistics, it was fascinating because we were studying how language is acquired, which is fundamental to children's development, of course. And in all of the data, you could see the importance of family in that process. So children acquiring a second language, children showing up at school, then the data would show, well, it depended so much on what their home life was like, how many books there were, and how much language was used, and how much talking, what type of talking went on. And so it seemed like in every field that I was in, there was no question that these core relationships were very fundamental to development and flourishing. So that led to that kind of question, what about, given my interest in motherhood and fatherhood, what about this work context that often takes people out of home environments? And recognizing the importance of relationships, what shaping does it have on our ability to have those strong relationships?
Yes. So you focus on a range of topics. One of the major ones that you've been doing research on for, I think, over a decade is the effects of childcare, non-parental group care on young children, which I'm really eager to talk with you about. To start with, though, I'm also curious about what led you to be interested in that topic in particular in the first place.
Yes. It's really interesting. While I was in graduate school and studying work and family and women's responses to career decisions and opportunities, I had a fellowship in Washington, D.C., and I was just learning about this divide between academia and the policy world, meaning we're doing all of this research and study and talk in academia, and then policy analysts are trying to figure out what all of that means. And they're ending up having to redo it in a sense, or at least reinterpret it to then inform policymakers. And so I was trying to help in that bridging. And so I ended up focusing on a project that everyone at the time was really thinking about because there had been these decades of confusing findings around childcare. And they were confusing because, first of all, there's a big change that happens with women entering employment across the 1980s, right into the 1990s. So by the early 1990s, everyone in those spheres was like, does this matter? I mean, women are not, it's not only when children are 4 or 5 or in school that they're entering the workforce, they're entering when children are younger than one? And is that meaning anything? And there were strong feelings on each side, right? This matters, this doesn't matter. And so that's when the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development just said, we're going to do our best to sort this out by initiating the best finding that they could that would be longitudinal. It would incorporate all of the variables that seem to be important, and they would track children over time, children who represented to some degree the various levels of socioeconomic status and diversity. And so I was just in the middle of my fellowship when these findings that had begun to come out are further coming out, and people are responding and reacting to their meaning.
So, to put this in 2024 context, over the last recent period, last couple of years, there's been growing enthusiasm about providing publicly funded childcare for children from infancy through age 4. Some have increasingly been calling it public education starting at birth. We're in some ways past, I think, some of those debates that you're describing. It's pretty widely now described as a win-win-win that boosts the economy and enables women to work and advance their careers and supports young children's development all at the same time. You've expressed some concern about this growing emphasis on childcare, and I know that some of that concern comes from your analysis of your findings from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development study, or I guess it's often referred to as the NICHD study. Can you describe exactly what that study was? When was it run? How was it conducted? What questions was it trying to answer?
Yes, Catherine, of course. And it is really interesting, just as you framed that question, it's interesting, sort of paradoxical, that while you see increased interest in this universal daycare, we also have this increased awareness of the importance of early development and attachment, even because we can observe brain development. And so now it's more clear than it even was in the past that that right brain is literally doubling in size in that first year and a half, the right brain being the social emotional center of development, and that the development emerges out of close bonded relationship. So it's an interesting time to wrestle with these questions. So the NICHD, it started in the early 90s. There were 1,500 children from various parts of the United States to represent the entire country. And they took them from birth, and we're looking at all, at the time, all the variables they could think of that might be a factor. So that would mean home environment, socioeconomic status, marital status of the family, even neighborhood quality, and then going into the childcare center itself or the childcare setting. Was it a home setting? Is it a center setting? Who's providing that caregiving? What's the quality of it? What's the kind of cognitive investment in it, the development that way, and how many hours is a child spending in that amount of daycare, that type of daycare. So they're tracking all the variables that they can at the same time to see how they relate to one another. And these findings, it was by 15 months of age, it wasn't like there were a lot of differences between the children based on the hours they'd spent in daycare, although more time spent in any kind of childcare was associated with increased risk of insecure infant mother attachment, which of course people were concerned about because they knew how much attachment impacts things. Nonetheless, there weren't strong differences. By 24 months, 2 years old, children had findings that showed that if they had spent extensive hours in daycare, and I'll describe that in a minute, what that means, there was less social competence and cooperation and more caregiver reported behavior problems, but still not tons of difference. And what's interesting is by age 3, any of the negative effects seemed to disappear. And people began saying, well, it was something that showed up when they were developmentally very young, and it's not going to persist, and that this is over, right? The effects being potentially negative are over. But when they reassessed at age 4.5, it was really striking. And the challenges that emerged for children who had entered daycare early in life, within that first year of life, even the first 9 months, and had been in 20 to 30 or more hours per week, they were at increased risk of social emotional challenges like higher externalizing problems, more conflict with adults.
And when you say externalizing, can you just clarify what that means?
Yes. So it would be more aggressive behaviors. It's behaviors to the outside.
I see.
So conflict, aggression, as opposed to internalizing, that would be withdrawal, depression kinds of thing. And I think we're going to find out that boys in particular, we'll talk about the Quebec study, exhibit those higher externalizing behaviors more than girls typically, but that it started there at age 4.5. And it was so significant that it looked as if the effect of poverty, which of course we are concerned about because poverty is very hard on children, that the effect size for time in daycare was actually greater than the effect size of poverty. And so it just illuminated this is not an insignificant thing. And what it showed is that it's the culmination or it's the amount over time, it's the adding up over time that then predicts this increased likelihood of challenges. And then those effects persisted in kindergarten, first grade, third grade, sixth grade. And they're exhibiting different kinds of things: fewer social skills, poor work habits, more problem behaviors, more conflict. By the sixth grade, it was more teacher child conflict. And then at 15, this is adolescence, you're looking at daycare center time, more time specifically in daycare centers, predicting impulse behaviors that are problematic, risk taking, drugs, impulsivity, in participating in unsafe activities. So, what showed up at age 4.5 didn't go away.
So, in some of your work, as you just mentioned, you've also pointed to this newer set of studies conducted in Quebec,
Yes.
which you see as reflecting or reinforcing the NICHD findings. Can you describe what the Quebec studies were looking at and what some of the key findings from those studies are that you think are important to be paying attention to?
Yes. Yeah, Catherine. So essentially, what happened is Quebec launched universal childcare, not unlike what I think we have been talking about in the United States.
Yes.
It was in 1997, and the intent was to facilitate women's workforce participation and increase that as a highly valued thing. And so it was very inexpensive for families because it was public in terms of their payout out of pocket. And so a lot of children entered that daycare situation in Quebec. And so, of course, they're going to be studying what implications does it have. And it's interesting that on average, children who had been in childcare early on in the Quebec daycare system showed at 2 to 4 years old, showed significant increases similarly in aggression, hyperactivity, and in the internalizing expression of anxiety. And they had a harder time with parent-child relationships compared to those who had not attended. So it was shaping the home dynamic as well. And then, of course, as these children grew older, then just as we found in the NICHD among 5 to 9-year-olds, those social emotional problems not only persisted, but in some cases increased, and boys exhibiting the most elevated behavioral problems. Then most painfully, maybe, it's the 12 to 20-year-olds where they find self-reported health and life satisfaction had decreased significantly. And then you also see a simultaneous increase in criminal behavior across Quebec, and crime conviction increased 22%. So I think what the attachment work shows us is that at the core, it's a relationship that is enabling development, and it's a bond. It's an emotional bond. It's not children holding up flashcards and teaching them things to get their brain going linguistically. It's literally a communication of emotional love and connection and bonding that lays the foundation for well-being. Now, of course, all of these families love their children and are loving. I think in the NICHD work, there was not a clear indication that attachment was at risk, even when mothers were apart from the children for long periods of time. It was as if attachment really was shaped by maternal sensitivity whenever that baby was with that mother. It was beyond attachment. And that's what we're seeing in Quebec. It's the full social emotional way of relating, feeling secure in oneself, able to relate with others, not feeling tension, conflict that appears to be put at risk some when they're outside the security of that parent child connection.
So, I think one of the things that You and I have talked about this kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know if you could exactly call it a limitation of these studies, or in some cases, the way the results are reported is what you're describing are, for both of these studies, are broad averages across large groups of kids, right?
Yes.
And there are two implications of that, I think. The first is, and I want to talk about this because I want to make sure that people understand what you are saying. There are many children who are in childcare who, even going very young and even spending a lot of time, showed no effects, right?
Right.
And so I don't think you're saying that anyone who puts their baby in childcare full time starting in infancy is necessarily going to have these outcomes on an individual level, right? These are sort of population level findings.
Right. That's right.
And so I think that what that tells us, though, tell me what you think about this,
Yeah.
is that it's not that there's nothing there. You're not saying that you put your child in childcare and it's equivalent to locking them in the basement without food, right? That it may have no effects at all. It's just that there's enough evidence that for at least some children,
Yeah.
it can be detrimental, that on not on an individual level, families make their own decisions, right? But on a population level, on a policy level, we need to take these kind of population level findings really seriously.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and it's just exactly right, Catherine. So my husband, he was put in daycare at 6 weeks old, and it's really interesting. He was in full-time daycare from his early life all the way through his, entering school. And I remember when we were dating and I was talking about just some of the research that I had done before we met. And he said, "Let me tell you just a little bit about my earliest grade reports." And he's very bright, but it was really interesting because what he described was very, very consistent with what I had seen across the data. And he's a wonderful person, right? But it's really interesting that the 4.5-year-old findings would show that for children who were in daycare less than 10 hours per week, right, across that period of time, the up to 4.5, 2% of them were likely to be exhibiting problematic levels of behavioral problems, where 18% of those who had been in childcare for 30 to 45 hours per week across that time period were exhibiting at risk levels of behavioral problems. So that just gives you a sense of the increased risk, the level of increased risk. That's not all children, right? Obviously. But when you look across an entire population, right, that's challenging. And I think what others would say who were on the ground doing the research, Jay Belsky and others, is that you set children on a trajectory. That's what's hard, is for those who are susceptible and vulnerable to that, then they start with problematic behaviors and it kind of puts them on a
It
trajectory
sort
for
of
problematic behaviors.
snowballs.
It snowballs, yes. And for a child who's less susceptible, it's not going to happen, right? So it is just being aware that some are obviously more sensitive than others to these kinds of different environments.
And I think that that distinction between individual children and individual level family decisions, that making that distinction between the individual personal family level and the population level is so crucial, because when we're talking about policy, we're talking about the whole population.
Yes.
And what you're saying is these findings suggest that a policy that dramatically increases the number of children who are in childcare starting very young for many years on a population level, it's not like the whole country is going to fall apart, but on a population level, it might not be on average the best thing for children.
Yeah, there's several caveats. It's interesting, the NICHD study, that children were at greater risk when they came actually from more resource rich households. In other words, it was the comparable environment that was to be considered. So if this is an environment that's going to be less enriching than your own home, right, you may find increased likelihood of this predicting challenges. Whereas those who come from less resource rich environments may find a richer environment in that daycare setting, even though we have that additional piece of the bond relationship with family that is so powerful that we can't negate. but nonetheless, it might be a more resource-rich environment for them to be in. And so I think, yes, that's why I think targeting as opposed to the universal approach is much wiser. It's targeting who would actually not be harmed and be benefited by this situation. And those are the ones that we should be facilitating while we communicate caution for others.
Yes. And so that was the other point that I was going to make about the limitations of these studies. And that is the headlines, they also obscure, to your point, variation among different subgroups of kids.
Yes.
And I think the Quebec study looked at that quite explicitly and found that there was considerable variation in negative versus positive effects depending on the child's home situation. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Those who came from married, stable families that were more resource rich actually showed the most increased risk of challenges. And one of the things that was fascinating, and I remember us talking about this because it's very interesting, is that they looked at how these families themselves might have changed in the way they interacted with their children once children entered daycare for extensive hours. And they actually showed a decrease in child interaction activities at home, like reading and time with, right, engaging in games and those kind of things.
For those higher income to parent homes. Mhm.
Yes, that's right. I can imagine myself thinking, well, they probably read to you at daycare and we don't have time to do that right now. So we're going to do other things or not do that at all. And there's just something unique about children with parents engaging in those kind of things that is especially powerful. It's just not quite the same as someone else doing it. And so I think we have to think about how it shapes those families, and that some families that are resource rich, this might be more challenging for their children.
And then for the children that were from poorer single parent families, if I remember correctly, they were much more likely to actually benefit from being in childcare as compared to not. I think to your point earlier that the question is childcare a higher quality or a lower quality environment relative to where you would have been otherwise?
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Catherine. And there's some complexity to that too, as we know. Like, even for some children, just being outside the presence of their mother, even if it's not a resource rich environment, can be challenging, right? So there's some nuance to it, but it's more likely, it seems like, right, in the findings.
So, about a year and a half ago, there was an article that got a lot of popular headlines published by a prestigious academic journal called Child Development. The researchers published kind of a combined analysis of findings from seven well regarded peer reviewed studies that were done in Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Canada, and the US, all looking at the effects of childcare on children's development.
Specifically hours, right? At the hours they spent.
That's exactly right. The effect of long hours in childcare on children's development. So they were looking at findings from seven really rigorous, well done studies across multiple countries. And they concluded that there was no association between high quantities of center based care and behavior problems in children. So that's obviously a pretty big gap between the findings of those seven peer reviewed studies
Yeah.
and what you've been describing. And I'm wondering, how do you explain that discrepancy?
Yeah, well, it's really an important thing to unpack, right? Because it did appear like, oh my goodness, all that we've seen in the NICHT and Quebec and other studies, did it just get upended, turned over, right? And essentially, what happened is they were drawing on data from these countries to evaluate whether problem behaviors increased in response to short term increases in the number of hours in daycare. So they would watch a child go from 10 to 15 or 10 to 20 and then see, did their problem behaviors increase? And so it was really highlighting the short term implications of that and comparing children, different children from each other. Are these problem behaviors for this child who's in 15 hours different than this child who's in 10 hours, right? And it doesn't look like there's any difference. These short term differences are not there. And of course, those who worked on the NICHD and watched these findings unfold over time recognized, wow, the effects of hours aren't going to just materialize in the short term. This study, the NICHD that's longitudinal, allowed us to show what are the cumulative effects of extensive hours in childcare. And the study quoted in Child Development that you are referencing didn't look at cumulative effects. So, in a sense, it's not really actually addressing the question. It's not the question that needs to be looked at further, which is not the short term potential differences, but what happens in the development of a child cumulatively. Those effects didn't even show up till they got into school. It's not until a developmental process is shaped that then it emerges across development later.
It seems to me that's a little bit like looking at a child who usually has, say, a certain adequate level of nutrition
Yes.
and then spends a week, I don't know, visiting their
Or
grandparents,
how about Halloween?
right, or Halloween, and lives on sugar and Cheetos for a week and then goes back to their diet, compared to, it sounds like what you're saying, a child that was eating a lot of Cheetos and sugar starting at age 6 weeks every day for over a couple of years. That's sort of the apples and oranges, not to extend the food analogy, but the of what these studies were looking at.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. It's just really true. I know when we look at children's health, for example, they are really remarkable. Like insulin is usually healthy and they can handle sugar different than adults, but it's the long term, right? The long term inappropriate or less healthy environment that then shows up later as having implications. And again, it's not all kids, right? And it's not to say that daycare is sugar and cheap food for kids. That's right.
Right.
But it's to say that we, as human beings, we have these developmental needs. That infant emerges from the womb, they have to establish a bond of connection in order to develop. They have to. And so we really are social creatures. We are relational beings, and our development and our well being and our flourishing is really grounded in relational dynamics. And for a developing human being, it needs to look a particular way in order for development to be most likely to be healthy.
Yes. So, to switch gears, we have been talking about the impact of childcare on children, but I know your academic focus is also on the well being of mothers.
Yes.
And as you know, people argue that leaving these effects, whatever they are, on children, that for women, making affordable, high quality childcare available to everyone is crucial to mothers' well being because you and I can agree with this. Women want to be moving forward, not backwards, which people think of as meaning that they're able to participate in the workforce on an equal footing with men and build a rewarding career. For one recent example, the Center for American Progress has just released a report called Playback for the Advancement of Women in the Economy, which emphasizes providing affordable, accessible, and high quality childcare for all women. It argues that, quote, sustainable public investment in the childcare sector is critical to advancing women's economic security, particularly by boosting maternal labor force participation and improving wages for women. And it concludes that, quote, a lack of affordable, accessible, and high quality childcare often forces parents, particularly mothers, to leave the labor force, reduce their paid hours, or pass up promotions or professional development opportunities, all of which harm their own economic security and their families too. Investing in childcare does not, therefore, just directly benefit families, but also the broader U.S. economy, particularly by boosting the labor supply of mothers and improving their economic security. And another similar example, a columnist at CNN recently wrote that encouraging mothers to stay home with young children hurts women, first because of what's often called the motherhood penalty, meaning that staying home damages a woman's career and earnings potential, and also because it, quote, further entrenches the very things that make so many stay-at-home moms so miserable. the isolated nuclear family with the mother home with the kids all day, men who don't do their fair share, and a society that pushes its collective care burdens off on individual women. So, as I said, your research focus is maternal and child well being. So, I'm wondering coming from that perspective, what are your thoughts on what are pretty serious concerns about this?
It's really an important question to tackle. I think, Catherine, just to start, one of the most fascinating things for me from my PhD work years and years ago was looking at what women actually want, their preferences. And it's interesting that when we look at, and this has stayed consistent, that mothers of young children, 0 to 5, more than half of them, it could be 50 to 60% of these mothers, do not actually want full time employment. A third want part time, 20% want not to work at all. It's as if they have this strong sense that, first, I think they recognize children needing them and needing the closeness of that relationship, needing a secure environment. And they actually want to. They want to be with their children. And they also want to engage in the career sector. They want to have meaningful employment, as you described so well. But that's not the same as wanting full time, having children outside the home full time. That's not what they see as ideal. So, in the research we did post pandemic, it was really fascinating. Back in 2005, I was part of a national motherhood project that was looking at preferences for women. And one interesting finding was when we asked, what is your ideal work situation? Part time, full time, work for pay from home, or not work at all? 30% of them, this is mothers with a child 18 or younger, 30% said their ideal was working for pay from home. Only 1% were actually able to do that in 2005. Post pandemic, right, during the pandemic, you actually had this situation created where all of a sudden that whole big group of mothers who had said that that was their ideal, right, it's accessible to many and they liked it.
So, take a step back. You're referring to a recent study, it sounds like, that you were involved with that was looking specifically at this question. Can you just say a bit about what that study is, what it was looking at, who did it, what questions was it asking?
Yes, it was the Institute for Family Studies, and we were looking at preferences around work. So it was a large sample of parents, a survey, and looking at their preferences now that they had experienced flexibility at home. The question was, did you like it, right? Or what would be your preference would be to work at the workplace or work at home? How many would like that? What your ideal work situation would be, and what your ideal childcare situation is. And so it was really interesting to find out that more than half of college educated mothers, 57%, said they were more likely to prefer working from home most or half the time. And 65% of college educated fathers said they were more likely to prefer, in this flexibility experience, they now were more likely to prefer working from home either most or half the time.
So, among the college educated group, more men than women wanted to work part or full time from home.
Yep, and that's college educated, right? That who would be doing the kind of work where they could, in a sense, do that, right? And so it just gave us a clear picture. And I don't think it's unlike what Nobel Prize winner Claudia Golden has found in her work of women's work across time is women really, really like flexibility. Now, why do women really like flexibility? Well, because it allows them to prioritize the things they care about. And so we know that married mothers who have the choice, presumably, of whether or not to work because they have another person who's providing some, they are more likely to say they would prefer part time work and that's what they see as their ideal situation.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that came out of the findings that was so fascinating is that the most preferred care situation for children among parents was both parents work flexible hours and share childcare. That was the best childcare arrangement. And we found out that full-time center-based care was only considered ideal by 11% of parents. A lot of parents with children who are young, 0 to 4, they actually felt like one parent staying home was ideal. That was close to 30% of parents said that. So I think when we talk about expanding universal childcare, it's based in the assumption that everybody's just at home trying to get into the workplace full time, right? Women are all wanting to do that. And it doesn't really capture what families want. And so we just have to be more responsive to what is it that they would see as the right kind of work family balance situation for them, and how do they see the care of their children, and facilitating them being able to do what they actually want to do and believe in, rather than assuming this is what everybody wants, this will be better for everybody if we do this, and not really tapping into what is it the families want.
Yes. One of the things that, if I remember correctly, you found, we have this picture that the question of caring for young children just falls on women.
Yes.
Like, not always, but we're talking like 98%, 99%, right? Is that consistent with what you found in terms of preferences?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I can say this, when they talked about their ideal work situation, it looked like this togetherness thing. Both of you working flexible situations where you can share that care as mother and father. Now, I will say married mothers were more likely to prefer part-time employment as opposed to full-time, and as opposed to being at home full-time, right? So they wanted a part-time situation. And married fathers were more likely to prefer a full-time work situation. So I think it's interesting because in some ways it reflects what we call a neo-traditional model, which is when we're looking at women's happiness, and we care a lot about women's happiness because women are more likely to pursue divorce than men are. And so just thinking about families and what makes for happy families, we've got to think about what is it that makes for happy mothers, happy women, right? And the neo traditional model, which comes to a preferred spot, is one in which mothers take the primary caregiving role, fathers take a primary providing role, but they both do more. Fathers do more caregiving than they did in the past. They're engaged with children. They don't see a division between home and work, right? And mothers do more professional work than women did in the past. And so it's interesting because it's kind of like like we say, a neo-traditional model. And women really want choice. They're happier when they have a sense of choice. I don't have to work full time, right? And I can prioritize when my children are young a dynamic that looks a little bit more flexible than that, where I can be with them and maybe they're in care part of the time, or maybe we're working this out together. I'm not depended on for the lion's share of the income. And that means we can create something that aligns with both of our preferences.
Interesting. Really interesting. There's sort of a rebalancing of
Yes.
these long entrenched kinds of roles.
Yes. And
And
it's tricky, right? Because I'm
yeah.
in academia, and one of the frustrations for me is that we don't have part time tenure track positions for women. We don't have part time positions at law firms that get into partner position, right? It's like the world has not shaped itself according to women's preferences and what I think might be best for families in many cases. And so it's either an all or nothing picture, and women don't like being trapped in that space, right? And I don't think fathers actually do either. I think there's a lot of would want more flexibility also. So we have a lot of work to do to, if the work world wants to reflect what would actually be families' preferences, what they would really want to do would be a more flexible dynamic where they can prioritize men and women, even if there's one doing more during certain seasons than the other in a certain sphere. But it's not the all or nothing picture that we're really left with.
Sort of family centered industrial policy.
Yes, you said it beautifully, right?
Right. So, another piece of this picture, which is, I think, from a policy point of view, challenging, and I would love your thoughts, and that is women with young children who simply cannot afford
Yeah.
to be home full time or even part time, either because their husband is earning, as you know, quite a few people in this country do, minimum wage or 20,000 or 25,000 or $30,000 a year, which is not going to be enough to support a family. Or, as you know, there are a large proportion of children, young children living only with their mother.
Yeah.
And those children don't have different developmental needs from this perspective of bonding, right?
Right. Right.
And yet we, I think for good reasons in our society, have a very strong emphasis on personal responsibility and people supporting themselves financially, whether that's a two earner household or a single earner household. But there's a gap there based on what you've been describing.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on how to address that?
Yeah. So it feels like a few things to really think about. One is, and I think we're at a time when it's just more clear than ever that marriage matters for children. I mean, we're talking about the effects of childcare. It is small relative to what we know about the impact of the two parent family on children's well being. It's like small pieces of that bigger story. And so there is no question that we have got to find ways to remove barriers to marriage for working class families, to address the fact that children are significantly benefited by two parents working together with them. Now, in some cases, and I think we recognize men among some of our classes are not seen as marriageable. They aren't able to earn, right? That economic reality makes it very difficult. And so we've got to find ways to strengthen those single mothers. And I think that's why targeting childcare and high quality childcare for those who are in that dynamic, as we simultaneously encourage a culture that reinstates the two parent family as the norm, right? That those two efforts are going on together. And I think I remember first looking at that early effort to help women get off welfare, right? There was that huge effort in the Clinton administration that coming off of welfare where there could be people providing for themselves, that kind of thing. And it was fascinating to see that children whose mothers started working, there was some indication that they were better off. Now, the attachment question would be like, wait a minute, right? Like, shouldn't we facilitate? But when she has a sense of efficacy, where she's able to provide, where she's in a setting that models effective caregiving, when that child is in a setting that models that for her, and she's able to access resources that connect her to a community that's healthy, then it's beneficial for that child.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it may not be her ideal, would probably be to be in a married situation where she can do more of that care for that child herself. But right, and the father can too. But where it's not possible, then I think we can value that when she has access to good work opportunities and that it can be of benefit for that child in the long term without disregarding that reality that the two parent family really is a privilege, that we should do all we can to strengthen the likelihood that children have that healthy environment to be raised in.
Mm-hmm. And another implication of that is for those children that you're describing, it really matters a lot that the childcare setting is as high quality and as kind of family responsive, family supportive as possible, right?
Yes. And I think we see that in the data as well. It provides a setting that models and supports. We know, for example, Catherine, that those interventions that are home centered, like that new baby's born and people come into the home and they talk through what it means to be an effective parent, that they can be beneficial, at least in the short term, they can be beneficial. I think what we're seeing is that parents do benefit from seeing how it looks, to what the environment looks like, what caregiving looks like, and especially if they've never seen it or experienced it themselves. We would want to do all we could to facilitate their experiencing it with and for their child, right? Their child experiencing it and them experiencing it as well. And so I think targeting that with the highest quality is the right thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. So, as a last question, you have been in this field now for quite a while. It's been evolving. What are you most worried about? And what are you most optimistic or excited about seeing in how this arena of maternal and child well-being in the context of work and family life has evolved?
Yeah. I don't want to be too far out, but I am in the midst of unpacking what's going on culturally for us with relational health, with mental health. And we're at a difficult time. We have a very high suicide rate among some, especially among men in working class situations. We have an increase in mental health challenges among our young adults and our adolescents, decrease in happiness. And there's no question that relationships are shaping that. and a lack of core relationships, a lack of access to marriage, a lack of strong bonded families. It's shaping that. And so I think when the 75-year Harvard study, right, after 75 years, looking at these young people from Harvard develop, it's men, right, but tracking them for 75 years, what is it that creates a flourishing life? And George Vallant's going to end it with happiness is love, full stop. And there just has to be a reinvigoration of a recognition that we are relational beings. We need strong relationships. We need strong marriages. We need strong bonded relationships with children. And that a culture that fragments us and pulls us apart and removes us from what it means to belong to one another and be called upon to be our best is going to inhibit our development, our flourishing as human beings. And we're living in a culture of atomization, and we see the effects. Now, what that means for mothers and children and families and children, I think, is a reinvigoration that our work-ist orientation, as opposed to a family-ist orientation, our orientation that says identity is bound up in work, that this is what matters, is leaving us hungry. It cannot satiate and fulfill the deepest longings of the human heart, which is to be in deep connected relationships with other people. And so, however we come to work out women and work and men and work and daycare, that truth has to be fundamental. There's just nothing that can replace the meaning of these core relationships in people's lives. And if we lay that at the foundation, we're going to be creative about how to facilitate happiness and well-being in ways that honor who we really are as human beings.
Jenet, thank you so much.
Yeah, wonderful to be able to talk about these things, Catherine, with you, who's an expert. What a gift.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm very grateful for you taking the time.
Yeah, happy to be on. Thanks for the work you're doing.
Thanks so much to Jenet for a terrific conversation. And thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us today. Please subscribe to the podcast so you're always up to date. Check out CCFP's work at ccfp.org and follow us on Twitter at _CCFP and at KB Stevens. We'll see you on the next episode of Early Matters.
You've been listening to Early Matters, the podcast on the science and policy of early childhood, produced by the Center on Child and Family Policy.